where somebody can go into OSVDB, run a search, pull up a software package, whether it be by a time date or by a specific classification, if it's a remote exploit or a web-based exploit, and try to figure out exactly what it is that they need to fix in their particular environment.
And if you actually wind up, this is something probably not a lot of people are aware of, if you actually wind up digging down into the source code to try and understand a particular vulnerability, sometimes you can't help but trip over 10 other vulnerabilities that are just staring you in the face as you're trying to look and diagnose one of those. So it's unfortunate, but at CVE we just don't have the resources to go and dig into all these others, so we have to kind of adopt a policy of enlightened disinterest, as it were, just so that we can get our jobs done.
And one of the other issues is classification, and I know you attempt to classify how serious a vulnerability might be, but it will mean different things to different people. So how do you just attempt to say how serious a vulnerability is?
CVE has a close relationship with the National Vulnerability Database, NVD. So we let them, or rather they are willingly generate CVSS scores based off of the CVE descriptions as well as other information sources. CVSS at least aims to be a fairly unified, consistent scoring mechanism. But for those who don't use CVSS, we have a rough set of terms of about 10 different terms: remote code execution, executing arbitrary commands. We have a few different flavors of denial of service. So we roughly break down consequences into around 10 different categories or so. That kind of thing is done by most other databases. And thinking about it from the sysadmin perspective, that's about as far as you can go.
John, as somebody who's receiving an audit from a third party, they might, and I know we've gone through this experience before, based on how serious a vulnerability is, I think you recall the rootkit that was on the Cisco router, that was a serious vulnerability.
Right.
So how do you deal with these kinds of audit reports that say you've got a serious issue and you know it's not?
Well, it's the response that we write to the audit report to our senior management, classifying it as what we consider the real business risk. Because what the auditor is looking at is just what they think the technical vulnerability is. They don't really understand our business. And we have to translate what they're saying into how it affects our business so we can guide senior management on how to properly respond to these.
HDB?
I just had a quick comment about a lot of times the folks who are doing the classification of vulnerabilities, either the Metasploit team who's taking public exploits and converting them to Metasploit modules, Kelly working at OSVDB, Steve working at MITRE working at CVE. Oftentimes the vulnerability classifier or vulnerability consumer sometimes ends up becoming the original source for the data as well. I mean, something we see a lot of times when Joshua Drake or Steve Tornio are looking through the Metasploit modules, they realize that, hey, this is a different vulnerability than one we've already have classified someplace else, and they, basically in the process of either figuring out a public exploit or classifying a public exploit, they end up coming up with a brand new vulnerability that they have to figure out what they're doing with. I mean, one of the challenges I see right now in the vulnerability management area is that the folks who are responsible for classifying, testing, and dealing with vulnerabilities often run into new bugs and have no easy way to really track those and make those public. And OSVDB does a great job of creating new entries when they find those, but understand Steve's point that they tend to be time constrained and they can't really dig into every possible bug of every application when they do find a vulnerability.
Let's move on to the next slide. This is an area that would involve Chris and John, basically. Vulnerability monitoring testing in the end user organization, and this is where you get various vulnerability scanners, other vulnerability software, your SIMs, your IDS, firewalls, logs, and basically how you're discovering vulnerabilities in the enterprise. So you could be discovering vulnerabilities that have been publicly released that are part of a vulnerability database, or these vulnerabilities could be in your configurations or your locally developed applications. Chris, did you have a few comments?
Sure. So, with the rise of web applications, we're seeing more and more organizations have a larger percentage of the code that they're running to that they have to run their business is custom code. It's either developed by their own internal development team or it's been outsourced and built. So you have a set of vulnerabilities that's unique to your organizations because it's in your applications. that don't exist anywhere else. So that you in essence are the vendor in those cases, and you sort of have to do your own vulnerability management. Ideally, you would have discovered any vulnerabilities in the web applications during the SDLC, but that's obviously not typically the case. There are vulnerabilities that go into production, either because you didn't do enough security testing in the SDLC, your outsourcer didn't do it, or the application's just old. It might be a 10-year-old application, and you didn't have a notion of web scanners back then. So in those cases, you have to have a process of testing what's deployed, and then managing those vulnerabilities internally. So prioritizing them. I know we talked about it that's actually on the next slide, but the idea is now we're seeing a confluence kind of network scanners that are looking for vulnerabilities that are known and publicly disclosed, and they're starting to look at vulnerabilities that are in web applications too, and they're sort of coming together, both sources of vulnerabilities.
And John, your company, the point of the business is not to do vulnerability research, but do you find you're ending up in that business anyway?
Well, I am. So like Chris, I deal with two different kinds of vulnerabilities. I deal with the ones reported from vendors of applications or systems that I purchase, and then I have the ones from my own in-house applications. And actually, I can top you, Chris. I've got applications that are 35 years old running.
There might be some problems in there that you didn't discover.
We have hundreds of applications that our clients use that range anywhere from Web 2.0 going all the way back to IBM 360, 370 assembler that are still in production, still generating revenue. So I have a much bigger task of finding the right sets of tools to be able to test for vulnerabilities on a wide variety of platforms, and I go beyond just the vulnerability testing. I'm looking at how do I integrate tools and techniques going all the way back to initial development, training of developers. It's a huge task.
So your way of discovering the vulnerabilities will be through the tools and also through your own research, but at sometimes, and not your organization necessarily, but others where I've worked, you get to know about vulnerabilities from an external source, say mail from a hacker who's saying, hey, I found this hole in your software, and that's something that you have to deal with sometimes. As Bloomberg found out. You worked on that case.
And the bigger challenge I have is that I've got applications that it's a diminishing pool of people who actually remember even how to code in those languages. How do I look for vulnerabilities in some of those very, very old apps?
Okay. Let's move on since we're running out of time. Remediation, it sounds like it's an easy thing. Organizations issue a patch, and isn't it simple, John? You just patch your systems and you're good, right?
No, it doesn't quite work that way. So if I look at, again, two different types of vulnerability management. On the vendor side, I look at what a vendor provides us. We have to look at deploying the patch within a test environment, testing all of our applications to make sure nothing is broken, looking at how the vulnerability impacts us to determine, do I patch my production machines first, or do I patch my desktops first, or do I patch my non-production servers? I have to look at what's the vulnerability, where's the impact the greatest to plan my attack. I had actually one vulnerability. It seemed rather innocuous, but it took almost a year to roll it out because it impacted so many different platforms and so many different people and a bunch of different customers. So some vulnerabilities can go out vulnerability patches can go out very quickly. Others take months to actually get rolled out completely into production.
So my colleague Paul Asadorian in his blog post has brought up the issue of prioritization. Do you only patch for the critical vulnerabilities? Do you ignore the low ones? And Kelly, we were talking about this yesterday.
Yeah, it gets to be a little bit confusing sometimes, and as Carole mentioned, Paul's blog post said, the previous train of thought was that you would go after your critical vulnerabilities first and then go after your high ones, and by the time that you got into another patch cycle, you'd be focusing on another critical set and another high set. So when do you ever find the time to patch or upgrade on your medium and low ones? Doing it as we've seen now, with Patch Tuesday coming out on the second Tuesday of every month, with Oracle moving to a quarterly patch cycle, with Adobe looking like they're probably going to be doing something along the same thing. You can go ahead and patch the critical and the high ones